Thank you. My name's Tim. I'm an alcoholic. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about step 6 this evening, but I might mention a couple of other things as well. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me back. Uh, it can't have been too awful last time, otherwise I wouldn't have been invited back, but who knows. Um, my date of sobriety is the 24th of July, 1993. My home group is the Hoxton Big Book Step on a Friday. And in the current situation, I'm also hosting a big book meeting online, which meets 13 times a week, every morning at 7 a.m. and then every evening at 7 p.m. except Friday, because that's my other ordinary home group. And to place I've said this before in the previous talks, was I did a traditions talk, I think a couple of months ago, maybe. But I'll say it again because some of the people are different. So the solution to my alcoholism actually, just on that point, is very simple. The first year in AA, it was all a mystery. I was assembling all sorts of different facts from different places, but when you boil it down, it's very simple. I drank vast quantities and had horrible consequences. So far, so good. That's the easy bit. The tricky bit is that what should my response to that been? Well, it should have been to cut down the quantity or to cut it out altogether. I seem constitutionally unable to drink moderately, so that item is off the menu. So my only two options are to be completely sober or to be largely drunk. Those are the two options. And sometimes people said that I hear this said a lot. Being sober was intolerable, which is why people went back and drank. Well, uh, I understand that. I mean, certainly I was bonkers when I was sober. I was very unhappy. But here's the thing. I resumed drinking after periods of sobriety when things were going better than they had ever gone. So me staying sober is not contingent on things going well in my life. And I've stayed sober through periods in the last 27 years of great difficulty. And yet I didn't drink. So it's got nothing to do with that. Relapse has got nothing to do with whether my circumstances are good or bad, or whether I feel good or bad. It's got to do with something else. It's got to do with my mind playing tricks on me. And the trick it will play is a very simple one. A drink is a good idea. And if I'm in the habit of doing what I want to do, I'm going to drink one day. Because one day I will want to drink. It won't make any sense, but I'll want to. So I've got to not be in charge. That's the basis of step 3. If I'm in charge, I'll drink. I need a higher authority in charge of me. And the thing about that, I think I may have mentioned this before, I never remember what I've said to whom. I talk to a lot of people. If you've got a cat that wants to go out, it will wait all day for the one moment the door is open, then shoot out just at the moment you open the door. If you want to keep the cat in, you've got to keep the door shut. If I'm going to stay sober, I have to have the higher power in charge all day, every day, because the moment I'm in charge is precisely the moment that the cat's going to shoot out the door to the off license. Now, God being in charge doesn't mean I sit there like a potato. I'm 100% responsible for my life. And this seems like a paradox, but it's not. If you have a shop which is owned by someone, often the owner of the shop is not visible there. They own the shop. Legally, they own the shop. What do? They hire a manager to actually run the shop. The manager doesn't own the shop, he just runs it. And that's the point of having a higher power in my life. The higher power is the owner of my life. I'm the manager. Which means I'm fully responsible, but the resources to manage the shop and the direction on how to do it come from the owner. So I don't need to make any real decisions on my own. Any real decisions, any major decisions of policy or finance go up to the higher power. And the answers come back through the literature, through the principles of the program, through other people in AA, through my sponsor, through people with good, sound common sense around me. The steps keep me sober. The traditions keep my home group alive. The inability to stay sober on my own, it doesn't just mean that I need a higher power in my life. It means I need a group of people around me. Whether it's virtual or real, I need that group of people there. So the traditions are there to preserve the group. And then if you want to get work done in AA, the concepts, so that's your set of principles and procedures for getting stuff done, not going crazy in the process. So the traditions, when I speak on the steps, I'll tend to wing it just because I spend all day talking about the steps of sponsees. Well, not all day, but every day I speak to, a good number of sponsees about the steps. So you've got it all off the top of your head. With the traditions, there's stuff I don't want to miss. So, and also one doesn't get asked to talk about traditions in a formal sense very often. So I've got notes. So it's nice to be spontaneous and fun, but I've got a job here, which is to get some experience across. Any information I have has come from other people in recovery, in AA and in other fellowships that use the traditions. And the experience that I've had, well, it's my experience. And I've done service at all levels in AA, group level, intergroup, region, conference delegate, and I've been on a national subcommittee to the General Service Board. I haven't been a board member. That's the one thing I haven't done. So I've got some experience. If it's useful to you, that's wonderful. And if it's not, well, it doesn't matter. You've wasted an hour. Well, an hour is not so long. I'm sure you've wasted an hour doing other things this week as well. I know I have. So, but I wouldn't worry about it. If this isn't useful, it doesn't matter. Now this tradition 6, an AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. And then, if you'll permit me, I'm going to read the long version. So the traditions have got a short version and a long version. I'm going to read the long version because there's some useful stuff in there. So problems of money, property, and authority may easily divert us from our primary spiritual aim. We think, therefore, that any considerable property of genuine use to AA should be separately incorporated and managed, thus dividing the material from the spiritual. An AA group, as such, should never go into business. Secondary aids to AA, such as clubs or hospitals which require much property or administration, ought to be incorporated and so set apart that, if necessary, they can be freely discarded by the groups. Hence, such facilities ought not to use the AA name. Their management should be the sole responsibility of those people who financially support them. For clubs, AA managers are usually preferred, but hospitals, as well as other places of recuperation, ought to be well outside AA. are medically supervised. While an AA group may cooperate with anyone, such cooperation ought never go so far as affiliation or endorsement, actual or implied. An AA group can bind itself to no one. So a couple of general points about about Tradition 6. When it was originally written, it was written about AA groups, and around the country in America, the AA group was your primary cell of AA. There wasn't really a service structure in the way we understand it today, but it was so perfectly written, it actually applies at all levels of service. So what is true for the AA group is also true for the intergroup, for the region, for the national subcommittees, for conference, for the board, for any for conventions. Um, um, so it's not just a group question, it applies throughout AA. I might also at the end, if there's time, mention underlying all of the traditions are spiritual principles which I can apply in my life. If I have time to get round to that, I'll talk about the application of Tradition 6 in my life in general. And now it's funny that Tradition 6 should even be there, because Tradition 5 says basically we just do one thing. What does the group do? It carries its message. That should be enough. Tradition 6 really is an amplification of Tradition 5. It's as though Tradition 5 says stay indoors and Tradition 6 says don't go outside. Tradition 5 says let's stick to what we're doing within the room. Tradition 6 says don't get involved in this other muck. And it's interesting, if you read the short form of Tradition 6, it's kind of vague. You read the long form, it's really clear what they're talking about. They're talking about hospitals, clubs, places of recuperation. They're talking about any other activities which could benefit AA members or alcoholics. That's what they're talking about. Now, one of the reasons this is here is because you may be fully familiar with this already, but there's a little element of AA history. There was a fact which wasn't discovered by AA members until AA had been going for some time, and it's this. There was a movement in the 1850s, I think, called the Washingtonians, which was a temperance society, so a sobriety society, rather like AA. And they discovered that if alcoholics clubbed together for the purposes of sobriety, well, something magical happened. And they got hundreds of thousands of people as their members. Worked very well, except it collapsed and disappeared to the extent that when AA started, the founding members or co-founding members of AA had no idea it had even existed. Someone brought it to their attention. And one of the reasons it collapsed, and I'm not an AA historian, there are AA historians, I can give you their numbers, I'm not one of them. But the reason it collapsed is because I'm given to understand is it got involved in all sorts of other questions. It got involved in temperance more generally. It got involved in the abolition of slavery and that whole question. It got involved in local and national politics, and people fell out. If you see, and I know in North Wales, you're very placid and all get on with each other very well. But in London, group conscience meetings can be a little fiery. And that's just when we're talking about, are we going to have newcomers time or not? And people fall out and there are fisticuffs over that. So we get on badly enough as it is without tempting fate by getting involved in all sorts of other questionable activities. Now, one of the difficulties of talking about most of the traditions is we're very blessed in AA. I sponsor people in other fellowships, particularly fellowships in other countries which are in the process of establishing themselves and establishing their service structures, and you see the most awful pickles people getting into. But AA is actually very, very stable compared to some other fellowships. I'm not naming names, so don't ask me to. But it's very stable, and the traditions are generally very well abided by, which means that it's very hard sometimes to find lots of good examples for why we should adhere to them, because they're being adhered to. We don't have that many examples of catastrophic, game-changing tradition breaches, but there are a few which I can refer to. Now, the long form of the tradition talks about clubhouses, hospitals, treatment centres, and detoxes. I've seen two examples of where AA has got, well, in one case has been preserved from trouble by breach of, but by compliance with Tradition 6, and got into trouble because of breach of Tradition 6. So one of these outside facilities is clubhouses, and we don't really have them in the UK. There's one in London. There may be clubhouses in other cities, but in America there are a lot of them. And if you have any friends in America, in any large city, they're sure to tell you stories about terrible financial difficulties that clubhouses have. And the fact that they're separate from the AA groups whose members attend the clubhouse means that the clubhouse can stand or fail, and sometimes clubhouses fail without the groups being affected. If the arguments from the clubhouses get dragged into the meetings, it affects the meetings, it affects the groups, it affects people's ability to even stay sober. So anything which is going to pose a risk of financial irregularity or argument, you just keep it totally separate. In London, I've seen cases where AA members are brought in by outside facilities to run little AA groups, little sort of reception AA groups for patients of mental institutions or detoxes or treatment centres, or whatever you want to call them. I think the more you pay, the more likely it starts to get called a clinic rather than a treatment centre. If you're paying several £1,000s a week, they give it a fancy name to justify the amount that you're paying. But AA gets invited into all of these places. Where it works terribly well, in my experience, I used to run a meeting in a treatment centre, sort of private clinic in North London, where the AA group, we used to go in. It wasn't really an AA group, because it wasn't open to the public, but it was a meeting for the people that were there undergoing treatment for alcoholism and all sorts of other things. But what happened, we were, as it were, parachuted in and ring-fenced, which meant that no one in the institution had any say over what went on inside the room. We had no involvement in what went on outside the room. So there was a clear line of separation, and everyone knew who came to the meeting, they now, as it were, left the treatment centre and were in the AA meeting. And the reason this is so important is because, I don't know about you, I had trouble with authority figures when I got to AA. I'd had a few run-ins with authority figures, and anyone in a treatment centre is surrounded by authority figures telling them when to get up, when to go to sleep, challenging them on this, challenging them on that. If we're seen to be in cahoots with that, with those authorities, and this is true in prisons as well, it's true in all sorts of situations, people are going to be less trustful of what's going on. And I've heard of difficulties in prison meetings where people see the AA meeting in the prison as part of what the prison is doing, as opposed to a separate entity. So to keep what we're doing clean, keep it separate from outside controversy, and to keep it a place where we are essentially the peers of the people we're trying to carry a message to. We're equals we're just further ahead and we've been at it for longer. So that's the nature of the authority in AA. It's not that people are above each other, but their experience is respected because it's experience. It's a different, completely different type of authority. If we're seen to be in joint ventures with outside organizations, we pull in their corporate culture into what we're doing. And it also happens the other way around as well. A friend of mine was doing going in as a volunteer as part of an external program. I better not mention the name of the organization. The organization helped ex-offenders. And she was under very strict instructions by the organization on how to carry the message within her little step groups that she did. Things you were supposed to say on step 1, things you were supposed to say on step 2, the worksheets you were supposed to use, all of that stuff. She very quickly actually stopped doing it. She felt there was a conflict of interests. She couldn't act in accordance with her conscience because she was subject to an authority which is outside the scope of AA. And in AA, the only real authority we have, well, we've got two authorities. We've got the higher power, and then we've got what's called in the 12 and 12 John Barleycorn. If I breach the traditions of AA too severely, eventually I'll drink again. That's the other authority which keeps me in line. Another breach of tradition 6 that I've seen over the years, I've seen people try to peddle other perfectly worthy endeavors. For instance, yoga, psychotherapy, religious instruction, or social events. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of those. I have no opinion on any of those. But what isn't kosher is to leave your little yoga card on everyone's chair in the meeting. If you calling it yoga for AAs does not fly, is yoga. To keep the two things completely separate. I've heard people do chairs. Again, I'm not naming names or giving places, where I heard someone say, well, the AA program is very good, but if you've got a problem with guilt or shame or low self-worth, don't expect AA to help you. You'll need therapy. And by the way, I'm a therapist. If you're interested, call me after, come and talk to me afterwards. I'll give you my card. Probably best not to do that. So we keep a very, very clear line in AA between what's inside AA and what's outside AA, and not to try to lend anything else the AA seal of approval by calling it AA. And I'm going to come to how that works in practice with conventions, because there is a specific issue there. It talks in Tradition 6 about not financing outside activities, and we've got to be very clear what that means, because sometimes I've heard ridiculous arguments on step 6, because the notion of financing something is misunderstood, and the notion of affiliation, that's one of the words used in the long form, and people quote affiliation to oppose all sorts of perfectly legitimate things. So we've got to understand what those mean. So when financing is not okay in AA, it's okay to pay for goods and services. So if you hire a room from a church hall, you're paying for the service. You're not endorsing the church by paying for a room there. By financing, what is meant is giving some kind of contribution at the level of capital or as a donation. An example is I was on the National Subcommittee for Armed Services Liaison for 4 or 5 years, however many years it was. And there's something called the Confederation of Service Charities, which is an organization which groups together all of the charities which deal with the armed services. And there was an option of becoming a member of this confederation in order to attend events and communicate more readily with the other service charities. The trouble is, we'd be contributing at the level of the organization's cost structure. It's becoming part of it. So if your AA group pays, St Agnes Church Hall 30 quid a week for rent, it's not thereby becoming part of the church. Whereas if we become part of this confederation, we become part of the organization, and that's what affiliation is. So financing and affiliation are very closely linked. Another aspect of affiliation is professing your agreement with an ideology or a set of beliefs. So those are the two ways you can affiliate, either by becoming part of the organization or by um, uh, uh, expressing or implying that you agree with a set of ideas. Which is why, this is a personal view, I don't think it's a good idea for the name of an AA group to adopt the name of the venue if the venue is religious. I mean, I'm religious. It's not because I have a problem with religion. It's because I like the two things to be kept separate. Someone that goes to the St Agnes Catholic Church group of AA, is that an AA group, or is that connected with the church somehow? And there are 12-step groups which are connected with religious organizations, but they don't call themselves AA. They call themselves the so-and-so 12-step group. So it's very important to make sure with affiliation that it's at the level of perception and fact. So not only do we have to be careful about who we tie ourselves to, but we don't want to give people the impression that we're tying ourselves to an external organization. And some armed services liaison officers, that's a service role at intergroup and at region level. Sometimes they had cards printed. You need contact cards if you're going to do liaison work, fine. But they printed insignias of the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy on there, and you can't take their name, and you can't tie your name to them. When I'm going in as an armed services liaison officer, I'm representing AA only. I'm not in cahoots with any other organization, noble as it is. So just to look at what would constitute a breach, because often discussions, as I said, get out of hand when it comes to, is something a traditions breach? And to really have a discussion, you've got to have sound definitions of terms, and here are some which have helped me. So financing something is to give it money to help it survive and run. Lending the AA name to something is basically including the AA name in any other activity. Endorsement is saying something is good. And affiliation, as I said, is formally incorporating yourself into the structure of something or expressing an ideological affiliation. Now, this does mean that we can work together. And I'll give you an example. NHS England runs something called the Armed Forces Networks. There are 4. I haven't been involved for a couple of years, so I'm not quite sure what the current status is. But at the time, there were 4 in England. There were separate structures in Wales and Scotland. And these armed forces networks were informal meetings. They weren't organizations, they were informal meetings where different stakeholders in the area of military health could show up and participate in discussions and present. So you'd have representatives of the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Army Welfare Services, the Army Hives, lots of NHS bodies, the commissioning bodies within the NHS. You'd have representatives from all sorts of service charities, and AA would turn up too. But when we were there, we were just the AA people sitting in the corner, wearing the dunce hats with all these professionals. We're not part of the organization. We're there to cooperate, to drop our experience in the room if anyone wants it, and to leave again. We weren't supporting any organisation. We were just present, and that's on this side of the line. That's something that's perfectly legitimate, because people won't confuse us with any other organisation as long as we present ourselves correctly there. And there are all sorts of other forms of cooperation. I mentioned treatment centres and detoxes and prisons. We cooperate with national parliaments to put on AA events. So there's one in, I believe, that's put on in cooperation with the Welsh Parliament. Armed Forces Day, same thing. We would, when you have Armed Forces Day events, everyone comes along, puts their little stand, and it's very clear to everyone people are just there in their own capacity. So what else? It talks about the problems of money, property, and prestige, and quite how divisive this can be. I'll give you a good example. My old home group used to go for a curry after the meeting on a Saturday evening, and you'd get sometimes 40, 50 people. Now, when we go back to normal meetings in person, the meeting I would go to on a Saturday, we'd go to Nando's afterwards. And if you've had the pleasure of going to a Nando's, you'll know that you pay for your food on the way in. So there's no argument about bills at the end. But I'll tell you, it took a while to work out this. When we used to go to a curry place, there'd sometimes be a table of 20 people, and you want to split the bill at an AA. Have you ever tried to split the bill at an AA meeting? No one admits to having poppadoms. No one admits to the drinks. No one wants to pay for service. And me and a friend of mine were the grown-ups, so the adult supervision at one end of the table with the rugrats all the way down the table. Every single week, everyone would put in what they thought they owed, and every single week it was between 20 and 40 quid short. No one would ever own up, and it was me and my friend at the end who just quietly stumped up week after week, because it just wasn't worth the bother of harassing people. Now, thank God that wasn't under the supervision of the group, that this little social event of fellowship afterwards was completely separate from the group, had nothing to do with it. If we were putting our money in, that was us doing that. It had nothing to do with AA. We were just a bunch of AA people after the group. When on occasion in my home group they wanted to have a discussion about where to go for fellowship, no. Outside question. Outside. The social event is an outside enterprise. We've got enough arguments in AA without having to bring that in. So what we decided is, some of us want to go for curry, we'll go for curry. If you want to join us, you're very welcome. If you don't want to, you can go somewhere else. No need to argue over it. No need to discuss that within the meeting, just to keep the meeting clean in terms of we're just there to carry a message. So when is something inside AA? When is something outside AA? I know we've got people from outside the UK, outside Great Britain, because I know that Northern Ireland is on a different service structure. But what applies here will apply broadly elsewhere as well. So inside AA is the fellowship plus the charity and all of its corporations and structures. Outside is anything else. And where this becomes a question, and this is going to be controversial, so, hold on to your seats. Conventions. This is just a personal view, by the way. I don't speak on behalf of anyone. In our service structure in Great Britain, if you want to call something an AA convention, it has to be financially and operationally accountable to the fellowship as a whole by being tied into the service structure at some responsible level. So there's no good at just being a group, because the group doesn't have the financial clout to or often the operational expertise to exercise proper supervision of something as major as a convention. So it needs to be at a suitable level of the structure. That's why you can't have groups running conventions for the fellowship as a whole because of the financial risk. But an intergroup can, a region can, a bunch of regions can, and the General Service Board can. And so conventions are run at all of those levels. And it seems nasty and nitpicking that we're not allowed to do this, but there's a jolly good reason why. Conventions, first of all, involve a lot of money. I mean, can be a lot of money. They're also pretty public events. If you've got, 2,000 people turning up at a hotel for a weekend-long event, that's pretty much in the public gaze. It's not a few people shuffling into St Agnes Church Hall on a Thursday evening at 5 o'clock. It's public. It's high profile. The risk, because of the money, because of the profile, the risk to the reputation of AA is significant. This isn't an abstract risk. I can't name where and when, but there was an instance of a convention held in a city somewhere which ran into financial difficulties. It was not sponsored by, it was standalone. It was not sponsored by the local intergroup or the region. There was an international organization which was not AA, but was using the AA name, which it was part of, but they didn't have any financial clout, and there wasn't a proper structure there anyway. Ran into financial difficulties. One AA member got saddled with a personal liability of equivalent of £10,000. It got into the local papers in the country in question. It was an absolute, if you'll pardon my French, shit show. And eventually the local AA structure, because of the effect it was having on the perception of AA at public level, had to step in after the event and sort it out. Example number 2 was a convention in America's big enough, an American city, where a convention center, or I think it was a large hotel and convention center, which had been used for decades by AA events, was taken over by a convention which was not sponsored by the service structure, and they did not handle the venue well. They didn't look after it physically. They breached all sorts of covenants they'd agreed to. The people were not experienced who were running this very big convention, and the venue and a whole chain of venues shut its doors to AA events, not just in that city, but in other cities because of that single bad experience. So the way, if an event is being held, it must be under the supervision of the AA service structure, which means that the committee is answerable not to itself, but to the fellowship as a whole through the sponsoring authority, so the intergroup or the region. You report in, let's say, the year running up to the convention, you report regularly on progress, proper financial accounting, proper financial reporting, segregation of duties, all of the usual measures that you need in place technically to run an event with a big financial punch behind it. With the power vested in the sponsoring authority, so the intergroup, the region, whatever, to do 4 things. 1, censure, to tell them off. Number 2, to redirect, to give directions about how things should be done differently. Thirdly, to reorganize, so to change people's places on the convention committee if things are not being run properly, to put someone more competent in place, or, and this is the final measure, to replace everyone on the committee if there isn't sufficient confidence in them. And that's what sponsorship of a convention means. And the reason to have this in place, in practice, it never needs to be invoked, because the convention committee knows that they have to keep their noses clean or they're going to be overridden and replaced. So the fact that that mechanism is there is usually sufficient to keep the convention running in a kosher fashion. And generally, when I've seen conventions run by intergroups, there are problems, but I've never seen anything run completely out of control. There's stuff that goes on in certain conventions which call themselves AA, but are not subject to the oversight of the AA fellowship as a whole. There are very questionable practices on occasion, ritualistic behavior, weird chanting, um, uh, things which the fellowship as a whole would not necessarily be comfortable with. And this is the problem with things being in separate structures. What else have we got here? I think I've covered all of those. I've got 5 minutes or so left. I want to talk about the traditions, tradition 6 specifically in my life. So tradition 6 and tradition 5, as I said earlier, very much tie in with each other. So tradition 5, stick to your primary purpose. Tradition 6, don't get involved in all sorts of other things. The two go together. And my primary purpose in AA is the primary purpose of AA, of the AA group, is to carry the message. My primary purpose is written out on page 63 of the Big Book. If you've been looking for the instructions, they put them in the Big Book. If your sponsors suggest something which isn't in the Big Book, challenge them on it. That's what I was encouraged to do. If they ask you to do something which is not consistent with the principles in the Big Book, that's maybe a better way of expressing it. But top of page 63, I get to do two things. I get to stay close to God and perform his work well. And that latter point falls into two categories. Firstly, I've got to carry the AA message. So tradition 5 is part of that. And I carry the message in 4 ways, and I want to make sure that this is happening in my life in some way at all times. So, firstly, within the group. Secondly, through sponsorship. Thirdly, through the service structure. And I'm currently a conference delegate, so that's what I'm doing in the service structure. And fourthly, carrying the message outside AA, and I try on occasions, I get offered opportunities to do that. And then to practice the principles in all my affairs, which means in 3 areas: at work, at home, and in my community and society as a whole. Now, sometimes people talk about balance, and I don't think balance is the right word. When you have something in balance, if you have a pair of scales, the two sides of the scales, the weight is the same on both sides, and that's what a balance is. Balance between what I do in AA and what I do outside AA. It's not 50-50. It's not meant to be. What I'm looking for is the right mix, and the right mix changes over time. Sometimes my weight falls much more heavily to activities within AA. Sometimes the weight falls on activities outside AA, but because God is the boss, I don't need to second guess that. I just need to keep asking, what do you want me to do today, this week, this month, this year? Any longer term plans, God, just let me know. Rather like with step 5 and step 6, tradition 5 and tradition 6 in the group level, in my life, I've got what is inside the primary purpose and what lies beyond it. What lies beyond my primary purpose is everything I was concerned with when I got to AA. I didn't get sober for honest reasons. I got sober because drinking was getting in the way of my plans. I didn't want a relationship with God. I didn't want any of those things. And my little list, which I used the whole time, of what I was interested in when I got sober, was sex and money and power and prestige and comfort and thrills and appearance. There we go. just one of those will be enough to keep you busy for decades, and I was busy in all 7 areas. Now, these things are not bad in themselves, but Bill uses a great line when talking about the sex inventory. He says some would have us no flavour for our fare, others would have us on a straight pepper diet. Now, those things, so sex and money and power and prestige and comfort and thrills and appearance, are they're part of life, but they're at best the uh, uh, the condiments of life. They're the spice. You know, the comfort and the thrills are the spice. They're not the substance of it. I try to make the spice the substance. I try to make comfort and thrills the substance of my life. Those other things, if you serve, you're going to get prestige, you're going to get power, you're going to get money. Again, if these become the purpose as opposed to the corollary of what I'm doing, if they become the purpose, I get all bent out of shape. So I've got to constantly detach from those things. I don't detach once and then I'm done. I'm now detached forever. I get reattached on a daily basis. I get reconcerned about these things. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of step 11 and vigilance. I'm not vigilant against alcohol. I'm vigilant against the bloated nothingness of ego. And one last thing. It talks about not lending the AA name to anything outside. If my identity is linked, or purpose or security is linked to anything outside God, it's vulnerable. So position in the world is vulnerable. Material circumstances are vulnerable. Ambitions are vulnerable. All those 7 areas of self are vulnerable. If my identity, my purpose, my security is located there, I'm going to be frightened. If I want to be free of fear, this is what I learned in the fear inventory. If I'm going to be free of fear, I have to have my identity in God, my purpose in God. I am spirit, which happens to be housed in a physical form. If you take away the physical form, I still exist. In the same way that if your mobile phone dies, let's say you're on the phone to someone and your phone dies or their phone dies, they haven't died. They're still at the other end. If I think that I am my physical form, I'm going to be anxious. If I'm going to be at peace, I've got to realize I am made of something that is not physical. I happen to be living inside a physical form, and Lamotte talks about death being a fairly major change of address, which I think is a wonderful line. I'm not frightened of death. And I find that almost all fear, if you trace it deep enough, is fear of death. And I found there to be no need of that. I didn't ask to be born, so I'm not here for my own purposes, clearly. There is some purpose beyond. I'm looking to ask what that purpose is and to serve that. I've gone 3 minutes over time, so forgive me for that. And thank you for listening.